On a summer night in 1281, off the coast of Kyushu, the sea began to breathe like a sleeping monster and then it woke up. By dawn, the shoreline was carpeted with broken masts, splintered timbers, and bodies in armor that did not belong to Japan. According to legend, one storm sank 7,000 ships and erased an empire's invasion in a single, roaring breath. But legends always hide a messier truth. Was there really a single divine wind powerful enough to shatter the largest armada the medieval world had ever seen? And if so, how did anyone survive to tell us what it sounded like? Tonight, we go where sea and sky conspired to change the course of history. The Kamikaze, the divine wind that stopped Kublai Khan. Will follow the armadas from their birth in shipyards across China and Korea, trace the coastline walls the Japanese carved into the earth. Out of fear, drop through the decks of storm-tossed warships at midnight, and then dive centuries later with archaeologists who are still pulling answers from the mud. Steak wheat may, because what happens next will shock you. Let's rewind not to the storm but to the invitation that made it inevitable. In the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had chained much of the world to its saddle. Kublai Khan, grandson of Gan, ruled a new dynasty in China. The Yuan Dynasty sent letters across the sea to a small archipelago he did not yet understand. Japan should submit, he wrote. Trade would flow, peace would reign. Behind the polite seal was a promise sharpened like an arrow. Say yes, or face the consequences. The Japanese court tore the letters, debated, prayed. Meanwhile, in 1274, those consequences set sail. The first invasion force wasn't yet the behemoth to come, but it was terrifying. A coalition army of Mongols, Chinese, and Koreans aboard hundreds of ships, slipping across the Korea Strait toward Hakata Bay. They hit Tsushima, and Iki Island's first burning, cutting, trying to break the buffer before reaching Kyushu. On the beaches near Hakata, the Japanese samurai expected formal duels and banners spread like spring fields. What they saw instead was a new kind of warfare. Drums thundering in time with volleys of arrows, massed shields, and most bewildering ceramic bombs that burst in sickening flashes, spraying shrapnel and smoke. The Mongol coalition pressed hard that day. Then night fell, and something else moved. A storm rose out of the darkness, turned the water violent, and slammed into the anchorage. Ships dragged, cables snapped, hulls kissed rock. By morning, the invaders were battered and, by many accounts, already losing heart. The fleet backed off. The first invasion retreated. Japan bruised, startled, and suddenly Lucky looked out at the horizon and saw not safety, but a timer being reset. They didn't waste their reprieve. Along the long curve of Hakata Bay, they raised a wall of stone and earth kilometer after kilometer to push an enemy back into the water next time, to force a landing under showers of arrows and spears. Watchtowers sprouted like teeth. Monks prayed. Blacksmiths hammered. The message was the same in every clang. If there is a next time, we will be ready. But Kublai Khan wasn't a man who stopped. He didn't call the first storm divine. He called it an inconvenience. He ordered a second invasion, so large that it would overwhelm not just the defenses, but the island itself. The number that echoes through time: 4,000 ships, 5,000 and even 7,000 B guns here. In the fever of imperial logistics, can one storm sink 7,000 ships? Let's ask a better question first. Could anyone build them? Across southern China and the Korean peninsula, forests were felled. Nails were forged by the ton. Ropes the thickness of a man's wrist coiled like snakes across shipyard floors. Officials scoured villages for sailors, soldiers, carpenters, grain-filled warehouses. Horses were herded to coastal corrals, and bureaucrats argued over rations in rooms that smelled like ink and panic. The Southern Route Fleet, drawn mostly from Chinese ports, swelled to a size historians still debate, perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 ships, maybe more. From stout ocean junks to flat-bottomed river craft dragged into service where they did not belong. The Eastern Route Fleet, from Korea, assembled with another 900 or so vessels. If not 7,000, then at least the largest armada anyone in East Asia had ever seen. In the Japanese imagination, those numbers melted into a single, monstrous shadow one that darkened the horizon to the ruins of every shrine and farmhouse along Kyushu's windward coast. And here's where it becomes more than numbers. The second invasion wasn't a single blade. It was meant to be a pincer. The Eastern Fleet would cross from Korea, strike fast, and fix the defenders in place. The Southern Fleet would come up from modern-day Zhejiang and Fujian, swinging wide with thousands of holes, supplies for months, siege engines, and enough soldiers to drown a shoreline in bucket. But at sea, plans unravel like wet rope. Most of what we think we know about what happened next depends on the angle you look from. Samurai chronicles full of prayers and poetry, Yuan records that measure victory in grain, and the cold honesty of timber recovered from the bottom of a bay. Through all of it runs one idea, simple and impossible. A storm so violent, it shows a side. Imagine it, because someone, many someones, lived it. A Korean helmsman squints at a moon that keeps disappearing, because the clouds won't sit still. A Mongol archer runs his thumb along a bowstring gone slick with brine. A Japanese sentry on the wall at Hakata feels the first breath of hot wind at midnight and thinks of omens. And then the wind stops being wind. It becomes weight. It becomes sound. Before we continue, make Suraju fully focused, because this next part changes everything. The armadas are in position, the wall is manned, and the sea is about to do what human beings cannot. In part 2, we'll stand on those decks as the barometer falls and the sky opens. You don't want to miss how the greatest invasion force of its age met a storm that did. The red orders tap into part 2 right now. There's a smell that comes just before a typhoon. A sweetness turns sour, like bruised fruit. The Eastern Route Fleet from Korea founded in the summer of 1281 as they nudged toward Akata Bay, testing Japanese defenses that now bristled with men and stone. Their scouts tasted it. Their horses fought the halters. Even the sea seemed to hesitate. We tend to picture fleets as neat lines on a map, but the truth is chaos, managed by shouting. The Eastern Fleet's 900-odd ships could not move as one. Currents pulled, wind bullied, captains argued. They pressed the shoreline, probed the wall, threw ladders under a sleet of arrows and stones, then backed off to anchor, to wait for the Southern Fleet's heavier punch to arrive. If there was a mistake, it was here. Waiting, exposed, while the sky gathered itself. Out at sea, the Southern Route Fleet fought a different enemy. The calendar. Typhoon season in East Asia is not a surprise. It whispers first water warming, air thickening, currents shifting. Yet orders were orders, and supply chains have a way of dragging men into the wrong month. Thousands of vessels jettered north, many built in Hastum with river hulls that did not belong on open water, others with seams that needed time and caulking they had not been given. If you're hearing the hinges of Disaster Creek, you're not wrong. Let's zoom in. We're on a Southern Fleet transport 50 feet long, its hull smelling of pitch. Below deck, sacks of rice. Thump with a ship's heartbeat. A handful of horses sway and stamp, eyes rolling. Above, a navigator spits into the wind and watches it flick right back into his face south. Then west, then something he can't name, because this wind isn't steady. It's hunting. The barometer. Nobody carries one, but they carry bones. And the bones know. Behind the scale and sweat of movement is something else. Math. How do you feed 140,000 soldiers even if we shade that number down to the low end used by sober historians? Wooden boxers on a capricious ocean. How much fresh water? How many carpenters? How many spare sails? The answer was always not enough. And every not enough magnifies when the air goes white. This is where the legend of 7,000 ships starts to make a different kind of sense. The word ship in the chronicles swallowed everything. Proud war junks, narrow supply boats, hastily commandeered fishing craft pressed into a war they did not choose. 7,000. As a round number for every hull that mattered: combat, cargo, ferry, scout across, both invasion routes and their staggered arrivals. It's not fantasy. Its fear's arithmetic. But it's not empty. On the Japanese side, the wall at Hakata worked as designed. It pushed landings toward predictable beaches, crammed invaders into kill zones. Samurai, many on foot, fought differently. Now looser formations, sudden night raids, small boats slashing at anchor lines under cover of darkness. The Eastern Fleet as anchorage became a bad dream. Ships packed so tight that a fire in one could eat 12. A single anchor dragging could set off a chain reaction of holes, hammering holes, and above it, the sky flickered lightning, too frequent to count. A different kind of drum. At a watchtower, a monk writes down what he sees. The strokes tremble, but they do not stop. Wind that roared like 10,000 banners. Rain like stones. Tide that climbed the wall. He writes one more thing before he runs to help move the wounded. They say the governor of Higo saw the sea boil. The boil arrives on schedule written not by men, but by the physics of hot water and spinning air. The storm born far south has fed on the open Pacific and now wants land, because that's where storms die. But before they die, they do their best work. The wind shifts and locks in from the east. Where you anchor matters now. Deep bays like Matsura, narrow pockets like Amari, the open back of Hakatide, all become traps with different shapes. The Eastern Fleet rides it first and rides it poorly, because they are already too close to shore. We're on a Korean flagship. The admiral shouts into the wind and hears himself swallowed. The anchor line moans, his boat small. Strong strain like greyhounds and gain nothing. Behind them, men vomit from fear and motion. A junior officer thinks of his mother as well, and the way a bucket slams the lip of stone in a dry summer. Now the bucket is them, and the well is the bay. The officer starts to pray, not in any language the Mongols brought, not in any language an emperor understands, but in the plain voice of someone who realizes he has run out of choices. If you've been waiting for the Southern Fleet to appear, to stabilize this, night makes mistakes bigger. The larger fleet struggles with reefs and currents around the go-to islands, and then with something worse. Zone size. The rear does not know what the front knows. By the time the news travels, anchor here. Avoid the shoulder markers have shifted, because the sea in a typhoon does not stay in place. A captain relying on memory will find that the memory is a lie. Somewhere in this chaos, a small, fast Japanese boat cuts anchor lines in the roar the simplest act, with the most violent consequence. A transport begins to drift. It swings broadside. A warship screams past and clips it, throwing men into the foam. The scream disappears, eaten by wind. The transport strikes a third hull and sticks to it like a spun bead of sap. Multiply that by 1,000. Now you're beginning to see it. But the enemy isn't just the sea. It's what's inside the sea. Badly chosen wood. Green timbers oozing sap under stress. Pegs that should have been 10 inches are 8. Iron nails that should have been 4, 2, a seam, a 2. Not in every hull, but in a wig. Think of a door left out in the rain. It swells, warps, refuses to close. Now imagine your life depending on 1,000 such doors staying tight in the worst storm you've ever known. But that was only the beginning, because where the invaders see disaster, the defenders see something like a miracle. A window opens for sorties in small boats, in the lull between bands of rain to set fires, to pull down desperate men, to push the chaos. The wall was built to fight men. Tonight, it fights the sea. Before the worst squall line hits, a lightning bolt finds something that never wanted to be found. A bundle of oil-soaked rope. Fire runs like a thought. 20 ships glow. It is, briefly, daylight at midnight. I want you fully present for what comes next, the moment when the storm stops being background and becomes the story. In Part 3, we go inside the eye, across decks breaking underfoot, and into the morning after when the tide goes out and leaves behind more than anyone expected. Don't miss it. Hit Part 3. Now. Midnight. The world is noise and water, and then, unbelievably, quieter. Quiet so complete that the drenched men on both sides think they've gone deaf. The eye of the typhoon passes over the bay. For a handful of Ministan, 20th the rain stops. The clouds tear open and show a slice of moon as obscene as a grin at a funeral. On the wall, a samurai named Masata Dahi will be nobody in the chronicles. Just a thin line of ink takes 3 breaths that taste like iron and cedar and then hears, for the first time in hours, a human voice. It is someone crying in a language he does not understand. It looks down. A man clings to a broken mast near the base of the wall. Masatada reaches his spear down, raises, pulls. The man tumbles onto the stones, coughs black water, and curls around his own ribs like a child. And then the wind returns. If you've never stood in a typhoon, here is the only true description. It makes decisions for you. The returning roll of air turns the bay into a river flowing the wrong way. Ships that had survived the first onslaught angled right, anchors biting, crews lashed to massa are now positioned for disaster. The wind shifts, the tide reverses, and everything that was ahead is now behind. Ropes snap like bone. Holes that had their noses into the weather now show their flanks, and you never want to show your flank to a god. The southern fleet gets it worst. Their weight, which should be their advantage, becomes a liability. A heavy ship, once it begins to move in the wrong direction, is like a fallen tree on a steep hill. It crushes whatever it meets. One transport, loaded with grain and arrows, shears off her rudder and begins to pinwheel. She hits a second, a third. Someone on shore will write later of a bridge of ships stretching from deep water to the shallows. And if that sounds like a metaphor, it isn't. The human details are what will stay with you and with the people who will tell this story for 700 years. Lanterns vanish like snuffed stars. Sailcloth wrapped and tied. Tears anyway. And the sound is like a scream you think you heard under your bed when you were 6 years old. A Korean oarsman jumps for a line and misses and falls between hulls, and for a fraction of a second he sees the shape of wood above him framed by foam, and then the wood becomes his world, forever. A Chinese carpenter, pressed into service months ago, proud of the joints he cut with his father's tool scrolls, and to the bilge of his ship to listen where water should not be. He hears it. The small percussive notes of failure, seam by seam. He knows exactly which plank is going to give way first, because he chose it from a pile that wasn't seasoned enough, and he knows the name of the man who told him to choose faster. He puts his hand on the plank like a farewell. When it goes, it is gentle. The sea is not always a fist. Sometimes it is a mouth. On shore, Japanese boats slide like knives out of hidden coves, low and fast. They are not fighting the storm. They are riding its back. They cut anchor lines. They hook and pull. At the wall, archers do what archers do when the gods themselves are hammering. They aim for the thing they can hurt the person in front of them and keep shooting. By dawn, the storm weakens. Not because it is merciful, but because it is done. It has spent its hoarded heat and momentum on timber and flesh and stone, and now it limps inland to die over hills that have no ships on them. The light that comes is the kind of gray that makes everything look like a memory. Hakata Bay is a graveyard. The shoreline is a ragged, moving border of bodies and wreckage. Horses lie with their legs still bowed in the shape of the ship stalls that are no longer there. Armor catches the light in 1,000 tiny flashes. Broken masts point in one direction, like a city of drowned fingers. The smell is immediate and promises to get worse. For the defenders, victory isn't a shout, it's something like silence. There is too much to do. Prisoners to gather. Wounded to bind. The living to separate from the dead. There is also opportunity. Relics of an empire lie scattered. Boughs of laminated horn and wood. Small ceramic bombs with their thin, cruel lips. Helmets of shapes unfamiliar to Japanese eyes. Coins with square holes. Paper with characters that men here cannot read. These will become offerings in temples, stories told in sake houses, gifts to lords who believe they won because they prayed hardest. And the invaders? Some lived. Some flee to islands like Iki and Tsushima, where they will starve or be hunted in waves. Some abandon their armor, scrape black muck from their mouths, and fall at the feet of farmers who have never seen a Mongol before and don't know whether to kill or help. A few, a precious few, make it back to holes that can still float. They look back at a coastline that has cost them everything, and they make a promise they will not be asked to keep. Never again. If you feel the legend closing around this moment like an embroidery hoop, you're not alone. Tis is where a divine wind. Kamikaze enters the text explicitly. Chronicles pick up the word like a sword. Priests write that the gods sent the storm. Generals nod along. In a way, everyone is right. Japan was saved, and a storm did it. But the sea is generous with its secrets. It keeps more than bodies. It keeps timbers. It keeps nails. It keeps the truth, stripped of luck and wrapped in silt. Centuries will pass. Fishermen will snag old wood on their nets and curse and throw it back. Then, in the late 20th century, people with air tanks and patience will sink into the cool green water off Takashima and find stories that parchment never told. Before we continue, Maksura Yo, fully focused, because this next part changes everything. What the storm left on the seafloor reopens the case. How many ships were really there? How were they built? What exactly failed? In part. 4. We join the archaeologists who pulled the armada back into the light hand. The answers they found will challenge the legend you think you know. Click into part 4 now. The first thing divers report, after the cold and the quiet, is the feeling of swimming through a city with no streets. Off Takashima, off Iki, in pockets. All along Kyushu's battle coast, the seafloor is litter-distanced, scattered, piled with the bones of ships. Under layers of sand and silt, they find timbers bored by shipworms like lace iron, concrete the size of fists, where nails once held hulls together. Round stones in neat stacks to ballast, they kept a ship's belly true now, tumbled spilled. The past is meticulous. It hides its shards exactly where they were useful to living men. In the 1980s, and again in the 2000s, Japanese archaeologists begin systematic surveys, side scan, sonar maps, the lumps and long shadows. Divers prove. Out of the mud, they draw planks with mortise and tenon joints. Frames that bend like ribs, the remains of bulkheads, the medieval Asian innovation that divided hulls into compartments and helped ships survive. They find anchors and styles associated with Chinese and Korean yards. They find ceramic shod celadon bowls and coarse storage jars that tell trade routes and hurried procurement. They pull up arrowheads, spear points, coinage stamped by the yuan. They even recover fragments that match descriptions of thunder crash bombs, ceramic shells that held early gunpowder charges. In one season, a diver lifts a copper fitting that, when cleaned, reveals a pattern identical to one in an old paintia. Small, stupid miracle that makes the room go quiet. What do these bones say about 7,000 ships? They say many. They say a lot. They say more than most people have seen in one place. Also say something nuanced. Not all hulls were created equal. Among the wrecks are strong ocean-going junks. Thick plankton well-caulked, and there are also lighter craft whose wood was too green, whose fastenings were rushed, whose river-friendly hulls were never meant to meet open water. Some archaeologists speak cautiously of wartime production, of quotas met with what could be built, not always with what should have been. If you're looking for numbers, so were they. How many ships does a seabed have to cough up before we can count the fleet? The problem is time. The storm jumbled the armada. 7 centuries of currents moved it again. Fishing nets did their slow, clumsy work. What survives to be found is a sample, a persuasive one, but still a sample. Then there's geography. Hakata Bay is big. The straits and outlying islands are bigger. As a team leader tells a camera crew once, squinting against the sun, we are seeing the edge of a shadow. Science does what science does. It adds layers. Paleoclimatologists take cores from coastal lagoons. Inside them are stripes of sonda, signature of storm surges that overtopped beaches and bled inland. One layer aligns with the 13th century, thick and coarse. A typhoon, almost certainly, and a big one. Tree-ring analysts examine wood from old temples near the coast and see narrow growth for a year or two after 1281, a sign of salt spray and storm damage inland. Put enough of this together and you get more than a story. You get a fingerprint. Meteorologists run models backward feeding in sea surface temperatures, prevailing wind patterns, and the geography of Kyushu. The likely shape emerges. A powerful typhoon crossing from the southeast, its eye clipping the bay or passing just offshore. A double strike across the night and dawn, with wind fields that would have changed direction as the eye passed. The models predict exactly the chaos described in scrolls. Anchors pulled, ships reset into worse alignments, second impacts. The storm wasn't just big, it was placed perfectly to hurt the invaders and help the defenders. And those 7,000 ships, when researchers map potential anchorage areas and run the math on spacing a low info swing room, anchor scope, and the random slop of human decisions, they find something surprising. Hakata Bay and the surrounding anchorages could physically hold thousands of vessels. 7,000 as the literal count remains high by most sober estimates. 4,000 to 5,000 for the combined fleets is more frequently argued. But the point is this. The number isn't nonsense. It's a battlefield memory stretched out by fear, compressed by time, but tethered to reality. If you include tenders, barges, transport craft, and the slow trickle of latecomers, the sea could easily have looked like a city of masts. There's another truth the wrecks tell, one the chronicles whisper but do not dwell on. The armada was multi-ethnic and multilingual. In the grit of recovered items are fingerprints from all over the Yuan world. Chinese sailors' kit, Korean tools, Mongol arrowheads, even Southeast Asian ceramics that probably wrote as trade goods or provisions. The ocean does not care what language you curse in when the mast comes down. What about the idea that Japan won because of piety alone? The wrecks shrugged. They show good Japanese engineering a world that forced bad choices. Small craft optimized for home waters. Commanders who exploited weakness without vanity. They show Yuan mystics logistics, dragging fleets into peak storm season. Production shortcuts that turned certain holes into coffins. A dispersed fleet that never quite cinched its blow. The storm was decisive. Human decisions were to... And then there is the scroll. In a temple near the coast, archivists catalog documents that have slept through wars. One is a letter, not grand, but intermittent account sent from a local official to a provincial governor. He writes of the wall, of men lost and saved, of bodies carried to pyres, and he writes one line that a modern scholar underlines 3 times. A great wind, not seen in our fathers' time, came from the sea and turned against them. It is not divine. It is not miracle. It is something else. Fact, observed, are recorded. This doesn't diminish the legend. It sharpens it. The Kamikaze wasn't a fairy tale. It was a typhoon maybe, 2 across, 2 invasions arriving at the exact moment when human error and human ingenuity could amplify it into history. But there's a thread we haven. Tipul Yeta. One that ties a 13th century storm to a 20th century word that would terrify the world again. Before we continue, make Sura Yore fully focused, because this next part changes everything. The divine wind didn't just save an island, it became a symbol, and symbols have consequences. In part 5, we follow the Kamikaze from Hakata Bay to the cockpits of World War II, and then to the storms of our future. What we find may change how you think about luck, faith, and climate forever. Tap into part 5 now. Words outlive wood. Kamikaze. Divine wind walks out of the chronicles and into a culture, hungry for proof that gods watch. Over Island, in the centuries after 1281, Japan tells and retells the storm the way families tell a rescue, each time sharper, braver, more inevitable. Shrines receive pieces of wreckage as offerings. Poets turn the noise into music. The wall at Hakata crumbles slowly into the earth, and its stones are mortared into new homes. But the story held in those stones gets larger. The number 7,000 ships survives, as numbers do when they become symbols, by being easy to remember and hard to argue with. Travelers who stand on Kyushu's cliffs look out across a flat horizon and try to imagine a forest of masts. The mind obliges, and in doing so, It preserves a truth under the embroidery. The invaders were many. The storm was monstrous. The island was small. Then, centuries later, Japan borrows the word differently. In 1944, as American carriers darken another horizon, a military leadership cornered by its own decisions instinctively reaches for a symbol of salvation. Kamikaze no longer names a wind. It names pilots, young men in aircraft, loaded with fuel and explosives, who will become the storm that the gods refuse to send. The word that once meant grace becomes a machine for loss. History has a cruelty that poetry cannot blunt. The divine wind, reimagined by desperate men, did not save Japan in the 20th century. It multiplied the tragedy. Does that stain the original storm? No, but it reminds us that legend is a tool, and tools are sharp at both ends. Let's zoom back to 1281 and look not at the ships, but at the climate that made the storm probable. The medieval climate anomaly, the warm patch of centuries before the Little Ice Age altered typhoon tracks and intensities. Warm water is fuel. The Pacific had plenty. Japan's location at the mouth of those great spiraling engines meant it would always be in a storm's path sooner or later. My favorite thing about the paleoclimate work we talked about earlier is how unsentimental it is. Sand layers don't care who prayed harder. They tell you if the sea broke the dune. Which brings us to now. Our water's warming again by our hands, not by the indifferent cycles of old. Typhoons today spin up faster than they used to. They hold together longer. They carry more rain. Coastal cities around the world, many with walls of their own levees. Sigetsar, practicing the same calculus the Japanese did after 1274. How to shape the next disaster so it lands where you can herd it back. Here's the other echo. Logistics. The Yuan made mistakes any modern planner would recognize: stretching supply lines, trusting schedules to hold, pushing inadequate hardware into an environment that punished arrogance. Every port city today, every island nation, is one bad storm away from learning those lessons again. The difference: our fleets carry not soldiers, but everything we eat, wear, and turn into electricity. If a 21st century storm sinks 7,000 ships, it will be in spreadsheets, and empty shelves, and economic shipwreck. So what, finally, did the divine wind sink? It sank an invasion. It sank an emperor's delusion of easy conquest. It sank, in the end, our faith that we command the weather. And it rised, for those willing to see it. A different kind of woe. The awareness that sometimes defense looks like humility. Build well. Anchor wisely. Choose your season. I keep thinking about that nobody on the wall mast set to end. The nobody he pulled from the water. Two men who, by all rights, should have been enemies, sharing 3 breaths in the eye of the storm. That is the image I want to keep. More than masts and numbers, because it tells you something numbers can't. History is made of small mercies, too. If you came into this story for the spectacle 7,000 ships and a sky ripping itself open, I hope you leave with something sharper. The spectacle is real. The lessons are urgent. Storms do not care who you are, but how you build, how you plan, and how you remember. Those are choices. And here's the unsettling postscript. Somewhere in the Pacific tonight, heat is gathering. Lines on weather maps are beginning to curl. We name them now. We track them, we buttress our walls, and call it progress. But the sea has never read our memos. Before you go, Max or yo, we fully focused because in our next deep dive, we'll investigate another storm that nearly erased an empire and left clues in places no one thought to look. If the divine wind fascinated you, the next one will chill you. Tap through to the next episode, and let's keep unraveling the weather that writes history.